All right, two things as we start back up again, okay? You see we're on day 16, and it said Chapter 8 brief. We'd already done that, so it's Chapter 9 today, all right? And completing the hands-on practices, etc. Now, tomorrow, it's supposed to be lab all day long. It's not going to be. And I'm doing that, so again, so that on Monday of next week, you can have the first hour to do the test on Chapter 9, but Tuesday, we're going to push it back, will be the hands-on for Chapter 7 and 9, but you'll have the entire 4 hours. And I'll say that again, I don't like to keep changing the syllabus, because then people get confused. So I'm going to keep saying it in class. Tiffany isn't here today, she's got a sick child, but I'm going to try to remember to say it tomorrow, and I'm going to try to remember to say it on Monday. All right, just so you have some kind of a clue as to what's going on. I do want to mention that toward the end of we're going to be getting assignments, etc. But if you look in here, it says midterm, complete midterm. Now, I've got to look and see if Evan has created a midterm or not, because I don't know if he has. But this shouldn't be a surprise to you. You are going to create a complete website. And that website is basically going to have all the different stuff that we've talked about up until that point. All right? And you'll have several days to work on it. Okay, just so you see that. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you as we get into this is if you look, what are we, in the 4th week or something like that? But we've already gone through the intro to the internet and the World Wide Web, the HTML basics, configuring color and text with CSS, visual elements and graphics, web design, page layout, more on links layout, and mobile tables. So we're now up to here. We're going to do that right now. All right. Tomorrow, one of the things I'm going to do, and I'll be able to do it in less than a half an hour, and I will, is we're going to go over Chapter 10. Because Chapter 10 is all theory. There's nothing that you're going to learn in there as far as, well, how do you create this? What do you type in for this? It's none of that. It's theory. So we're going to do that first thing. The other thing that we're going to do at the end of this lecture, and after you take another break and beyond, is I'm going to show you this. This is a Bootstrap project. I took a class, a free class online in Bootstrap, and I was hoping it'd still be out there, but it's not. And what I did was I started with this, that you can't see it, of course, because it's the Hello World. Really not much in there. Okay? And in 5 stages, we create this. And it's not fantastic, don't get me wrong. But I took a bunch of stuff from the actual Rankin website. So we've got this. This doesn't go anywhere. It is a button, but this is Bootstrap. So there's the St. Louis campus, there's Wentzville, and there's Perryville. This is taken again. All this text in there is taken right from the website, and I added a little form. But the other thing that you'll notice is if I come through here, is it is responsive. Notice when I get to a point, notice the people that are there. When you get to a certain point, they disappear. All right? And also notice when you get to a certain point, it goes down to 1 column. The bad thing is it cut the Perryville part off of this. And I even tried jacking with the image that I was using, but I couldn't get it back. All right? But hopefully you'll see that it's a totally responsive website. So that's pretty much how it would look on a tablet. That right there is pretty much how it would look on a mobile device. And if you look down here, it's got all of the same stuff, home, about, campuses, etc. All that stuff in my account, you get the same stuff that you've got up here. So we're going to go through that, and I'm going to show you the first half of that today and the second half of that tomorrow. We should be able tomorrow to have at least 2 hours of lab. All right, I'm not trying to hose you as far as how much lab you get. All right, and believe me, when we get to the JavaScript part, I've decided this because it's programming. I don't think you learn programming from watching PowerPoints or looking at stuff up on a screen. From day one, we're going to write code. From day one. And it's going to be code, 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 code. And then next semester, the class you take is C#. It's going to be more of the same. Okay? The author of the book that we use next semester, she believes, well, you can write any program you want from a command line. And hopefully you know what a command line is. But in case you don't, That's a command line. And you type stuff in there. Most people don't like that because it's not very graphical. So really in like chapter 12 of a 14 chapter book, she says, oh, let's talk about graphics now. Jeff's going to start talking about graphics on day one. And I'm going to have you create graphical programs from day one. All right? And then I'm going to show you how to do both, how to do it graphically and how to do it from a command line. Then it's up to you to choose which way you want to do it. I don't care. If Amin says, you know what, I like doing it like this, it makes more sense, then that's the way he should do it. If Valerie says, no, I like the graphic, then that's the way she should do it. You can trade off. I don't really care when you get assignments how you do them. I think it's easier to do it graphically. All right? It's more intuitive. Okay? With the stuff that we do, unfortunately, the majority of the stuff that we'll do for JavaScript will look like this. All right, but I've got some ways to make it a little easier for you, and I'll show you those as we get into that part of the class. All right. So we're on chapter 9. It's on forms. We already, we didn't talk about some common uses of forms on web pages, but usually, again, to register, to sign up for something. All right, to buy something, whatever it happens to be. Create forms. I already showed you the input. I showed you the text area, and I showed you the select. So we should be able to bam through those pretty quickly. All right. Create forms that provide additional accessibility features. I didn't show you these, but we will. Access key and tab index. We'll talk about those. Labels, field set, and legends. You've seen that already. Create custom image buttons. Well, if you don't like the standard button, guess what you do? You create an image tag. You get an image button. All right. It's not that different from when we worked with images, and you did that on your last hands-on test. Use CSS to style a form. I showed you some of that. Some of the new HTML5 controls. I showed you the email one. There's other ones too, and we'll look at some of those. Describe the features and common uses of server-side processing. I started to get into that with you. All right. Invoke server-side processing to handle form data. We'll talk about that. And find free server-side resources on the web. The good news is, as they say there, a lot of the stuff that you do with this is free. All right, let me close this. I don't think we'll need that at all. So they show you here, there's an example of a form. Again, most everyone has filled in something that looks similar to this before. All right? And you'll notice they've even got the drop down for country here. They've got the drop down here for state. When I did the drop down for state, since I grabbed one right off the web, it didn't have the abbreviations. It actually had the state names that showed. You can find ones that are online that'll show you the abbreviations too. Either way. So we've got labels here. Text box, text box, text box, text box, drop down, text box, drop down. I didn't really talk about the button, but when you click the button, that's what causes whatever you put in that action thing. Remember, I put the pound sign in there because I didn't want it to go anywhere. But if I would have put in there registration.php, then clicking that button, if everything in here would have been correct, and it's known as validating a form, but if it would be valid, then it would, boom, it would leave here and it would go to that file. All right, registration.php or whatever I called it. And that's what they're talking about. So when you work with forms, again, I told you what action was, I told you what ID was, I told you what method was, I told you what name was. So you've seen all those. The one they mentioned in here is autocomplete. And have you ever started to do this where you fill in a form and then maybe you come back and you fill out the same form a while later, you put in your name and all of a sudden a bunch of fields start filling in for you based on what you put in earlier? That's autocomplete. So you can turn that on or you can turn that off. All right, so some of the major form controls then, I already talked about a text box with you. It's got to be type equal text. So here's how you do it. Input type equal text. Then you give it a name and an ID. You already know what all those mean because we've talked about them previously. All right. Some of the other things that you can put in here, size. You may or may not have noticed this, and I shouldn't have ran through it that fast, but if I go real quickly, show you this example. Do you notice how the fields for city and for email address are bigger? You see that? Because I changed the size. By default, the size doesn't mean how many characters you can type into it. It means how big that box is on the screen. If I want to set this up, so for let's say for city, you can only put 20 characters in there. Let's just say I want to do that for whatever reason. Then I use something that's called max length. That's the maximum number of characters you can type in. All right? But size is just how big it is. So they talk about a lot of them here. Again, the key thing to this, don't memorize this. It doesn't make any sense to do that. You don't want to memorize, but you want to know where in the book to look if you need to create this. Sometimes people put a little mark on, or sometimes they fold in the page at the top, dog ear it in some way, but it's a page that you might want to come back to later when you're doing a form for a test, okay? So again, this looks like it's page 402 in the book, so it might be one that you want to keep track of, all right? Okay, there's other stuff in here. There's placeholder. You say, well, what the heck is that? Well, you may or may not have noticed that, but when I brought this up before, let's see, where is it? Can you see this? It says NNN-NNN, etc. format. Everybody see that? That's a placeholder. Notice when I click inside of here and I start typing, that goes away. Some people today don't use labels at all anymore. They don't use labels. What they do instead is they use placeholders inside of each field. So this would say type your first name here, type your last name here, type your address here, etc. There's a lot of different ways of doing the same thing. So again, these are all attributes. Type is an attribute, name is an attribute, ID is an attribute. If I say type equal text, text is the value of the attribute. So attribute, value of the attribute. All right? And they have you build a bunch of simple forms in here. Here's the first one that you build in. And they actually put some stuff in here to make it required. So you saw that before in the example that I gave you. All right. It says, why use both the name and the ID? Remember, I said this before. The ID is used for the client side, for JavaScript. The name is used for the server side. We've talked a little bit about the submit button. There's also a reset button. All right. And I want to show you this real quick. I guess I'll have to save it, but that's okay. Because I'm working with a copy anyway. If I come back to this last form example that we put in here, sorry about that. If I come back to that last form example that was in here, this one, and I've got here my submit button. I'm going to copy all of that code. All right, and then right underneath it, I'm going to drop that in, and I'm going to say I'll put 3 blank spaces in between. You now know how to do that. But I'm going to change this. Instead of submit, I'm going to say reset here. All right, so every one of these I'm going to change to reset. All right, now I'm going to run this again. So now notice, hopefully you notice, I've got 2 buttons. There's another one down here that says reset. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type in a whole bunch of stuff for each one of these fields. I'll change to a different thing. Illinois is fine to put a bunch of stuff there and there. Click, click, a bunch of stuff there. Now notice what happens when I click reset. That makes sense? It resets everything. People say, well, it removes everything that's in there. No, it doesn't. It resets everything on the form to its default values. So earlier I had set this up to default to Missouri. If we did that and then somebody else came down and changed it to Iowa and they clicked reset, it would reset to Missouri. Does that make sense? So it resets everything to their default values. And that's a reset button. Buttons have their own attributes and they have their own values. Okay? Now I didn't show you this, and I'm going to right now. I'm going to go back in here. I'm not going to do all of them, but I'll just do a couple of them. All right? So I'm going to put a couple things in here. I'm going to type in here. I think this is right. Focus, but I might be wrong there. And here I'm going to type in tab index equal 1. Okay? And I'm going to grab this. Again, I'm not going to do this for all of them. It would just take too long, and you'll get it hopefully after a time or two. here I'm going to say tab index equal 2. Here I'm going to say tab index equal 3. We'll just do the first 4 fields. And here I'm going to say tab index equal 4. All right, so now I'm going to run this again. Okay, the focus didn't work, but that's fine. So notice what happens here. I'm going to hit the tab key. Is that obvious what happened by setting the tab index? There are 3 kinds of people who use computers. Okay? There are people who learn how to do things from a command line. They're old school. They can do anything basically from a command line. All right? There are people who, if you bring something up here and you don't show them how to do something GUI, you don't show them a picture or an icon or something, they're lost. And there's people who use menus. But a lot of those people who use menus are also the same people that learned how to start using the tab key to move around. So sometimes, especially when you've got somebody who's trying to fill out a form quickly, they might start hitting tab to see if they can go from field to field. So you might want to set the tab index. All right. The other thing is, and it's much easier to show it to you like this. Let's see. Do they have examples here? No. All right, let's try it in Word. All right, so I'm in Word right now. If I click File, yeah, they changed that too. Doggone it. I don't know if it'll work in here or not, but we'll try it in here. No, looks the same. All right, back in the olden days, like a few years ago, if you click File here, it would show you a bunch of menu options. It didn't show you the ribbon, but it would show you Exit. And when it showed you Exit, it would look like this. The X would be underlined. Does anybody know what that means? If you hold down on the Alt key and you tap the letter X, it will do this. That's an access key. Shortcut, whatever you want to call it. All right. Control P will usually print something, that kind of thing. That's another access key. So you can set up your own access keys. And the reason I'm mentioning that to you is they talk about access keys in here. So shortcut, yeah, but it's also called a hotkey. You'll see that too. All right. There's checkboxes. We talked about type equal checkbox, the name and the ID. That checked. You already saw that. All right. You can disable them. You can disable almost anything if you want to. Maybe you don't want to allow them to put in an email address until they put in their first and last name, something like that. So you check, and once there's a value in both those fields, then you enable. Instead of disable, you enable the field. All right, and there's other things. The required we looked at. Most of the other ones are ones we've already talked about. Again, there's checkbox. And notice it does say checked. Remember I put that in there before, but it didn't work? Back in the olden days, before HTML5, instead of saying checked, it sounds stupid, but you had to say checked equals checked. You had to put that in. And that's one of the things when they came up with HTML5, they said, that's pretty stupid. Let's just put the word checked in there. Okay. So they show you how to create the same thing, choose your favorite, or the browsers you might use, and they give you these 3 choices. They're a checkbox because you might use any of them. Then they do the same thing with a radio button, but now they say, out of those, which one's your favorite? So with checkboxes, again, you can choose 0, 1, 2, or 3. With radio buttons, only 1, because those choices are referred to as being mutually exclusive. All right. Again, we've talked now about most of the things that are in here. You've seen these already. There's a hidden field. One of the most popular things that people show, I don't know why, but they show it for a hidden field. Let's assume, because I've seen this example in so many books, you make a form. And I don't think this is on your test, but you may have seen this before, because there's a ton of these online. For a pizza place. Why a pizza place? Because a pizza place is a great place to use checkboxes. What do you want? Green peppers, onions, etc. You can list 10 things. And they can check none up to all 10 of them, right? So that makes sense. All right. And then you can say, what kind of crust do you want? Well, that's a good one for radio buttons. Because you can't have deep dish and thin that I know of. All right. So, that kind of thing works for it. But let's say that I was doing that. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to give you your bill. So it would show you what your bill was, and then what do they always put on there before you get your final total? They put tax on there, right? All right. Well, maybe I don't have to show you how I figured out the tax. Maybe I don't even have to show you the tax. I can keep that hidden. Or a lot of times what you'll see is Amazon, they'll ask you the state you live in, right? And it might be, you might have different tax rates based on the state you live in. All right? And they can hide that from you because there's no reason for you to see that. That's typically what you put into hidden fields. All right? Passwords. The big thing with passwords is typically they type as black circles. Sometimes they type as asterisks. You might see those. If you say type equal text, even if you call the field password, if you say type equal text, it will show the password. If you say type equal password, it will do this. All right? All right, you can have a scrolling text box, so if you need to enter it over multiple lines, I'll let you read that yourselves. Then they have you build in 9.2 another form. This isn't that different from the one I showed you. Again, label, 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 text box, text box, text box, text area, submit button, reset button. All right? Okay, they do say in here how you can send form information in an email. We're not worrying about that right now. Select list. You've already seen these. That's what we did with the state for the drop-down. You can set up a select list so that you can choose multiple things. So let's say, for example, like me, I still own a home in Illinois, but I'm also in an apartment in Missouri. So let's say I wanted to be able to choose for state both of those. All right. Then there's a field that's called multi-select, where you can allow people to choose more than one. So, even a better example, I don't have this, but let's say that I had a summer home in Florida, and I wanted to list all of my homes. So I could have Illinois, I could have Missouri, and I could have Florida. That would be, again, multiple selection. And they tell you how you can do that. It's just you put the word multiple in there, which means you can select multiple ones. The option you already know, because we did this drop down already. We already did the example for states. Here's an image button as we move ahead, and we're on page 414, it looks like. Image buttons and the button element. I guess it's 413. But if you look in here, what do they have there? Well, what they're saying is it's a standard button doesn't look good enough. You want to pretty it up, so to speak. So how do you do that? Well, type equals. Notice you can say image, and you can give it something in here. All right? The button itself looks pretty boring, but you can spice it up a little bit if you want to, and that's what they explain in here. All right. Accessibility, again, the good news is I already told you about that label. When you say 4 equals, that's the first thing I showed you. That's an accessibility feature. So we've looked at that. We looked at field sets. We looked at legends. We now looked at tab indexes. And I mentioned the hotkey to you, or, whatever you want to call it. Shortcut, whatever. So we've looked at all that stuff. All right. Then in section 9.7, as we move ahead, and we're now on page 419, on page 419, the author talks about styling a form with CSS. All right. Again, most of you would probably agree that the first example I gave you was pretty ugly. And the last example I gave you looked much better because it was styled with CSS. All right. So they talk in here about how you can style things with CSS. Notice here's form. So that says the entire form, I want to have a background color of that gray. I want it to use Arial. If you don't have Arial, use sans serif, and put 10 pixels of padding all the way around it. Okay? Then we say for labels, I want them to float to the left. I want them to have a certain width, etc. So that's when we get this. Then for the input or the text area, I want them to display block. So we got them here. Finally, for the submit button, I want it to have a left margin. So it's centered on the screen. So that's just using simple CSS to set all that stuff up. Again, not trying to be funny, it's not rocket science. It's really not difficult. You're just putting into play the stuff that you've learned how to do anyway. All right? Now, I don't want to go off on too big a tangent here. We may or may not have talked about this back in Chapter 1. When you work with a web, the web uses HTTP. You've seen that. You probably have typed that in before. There's an HTTPS right there. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. What that means is you put in an address, you hit enter. Then your machine sends what's called an HTTP request from your browser. That goes out to a server someplace. The server answers that with an HTTP response and sends HTML back to you so it can be read by the browser. And if you understand that, that's what they're explaining in here. All right, do you have to know more than that? It depends. Back in the olden days, like in the 90s, you did everything using what was called CGI, or Common Gateway Interface. It was much harder. You had much more code to write. It was much more complex. Today, it's not that difficult. All right. So they go through here. This is the first time, if you run through this example, I believe this is, yeah. What she does is she has you create a form, and then when you create the form, you actually do give it an action. You send it out to her website. So that webdevbasics.net, that's her website. And then it comes back and it says, this is the information we received from you. Just so you can simulate sending it to a server and getting, sending a server HTTP request out, getting a server HTTP response back. All right. There's more stuff in different servers in here. There's PHP. There's Ruby on Rails, which is another one. There's Microsoft's .NET, Active Server Pages, which is ASP. Java, you can go out to here for Java information. All right, and I think it's about the last thing that's in here. Starting on page 424, they talk about the new, these are all of the new HTML5 controls that you could put in. I showed you some of them. I don't know if you remember, I said type equals email. Okay? I don't know if I put it in here. I probably did not. But for the phone number, you can, I did. You can put type equal tell. The problem with that is, for some reason, that's what will typically give you on your screen. That will help on your form actually give the telephone number where you can press it and then call. Not all browsers support that. Okay? And if you say, well, what does that mean? Well, what I mean is this: if I run this, you may or may not remember, but for the phone number, if I do put in a bunch of junk and I click submit, and I got to put in something here and I got to put in something here, it comes back and it says, please match the requested format. But if I remove that line that we put in here that says pattern, even though if I put in garbage, it'll still accept it, even if it's invalid, because it's a fairly new tag, and for some reason it's received very little browser support. So you can say, well, then why does it work when I put in a site, etc.? That's because they use JavaScript, which we haven't gotten to yet. All right. So you could put in URL input, which says you have to put in a URL, and you could go, that's a URL. No, it's not. It has to be http://www.google.com. See the difference? You're asking for a complete URL when you put that in. Telephone we already mentioned, and again, it says browsers that do not support it will just show it as a text box. You can put in search fields. My gosh, just about everything there is out there, on the web gives you the ability to search for something, so you can do that. Data list. This is kind of a neat one. All right, because when you work with a data list, let's assume this is a crummy example that she uses here for whatever reason, but let's assume I had a bunch of countries, and let's just say we put in, I'm trying to think of some that start with a certain letter, but Budapest, Bulgaria, whatever, a whole bunch of different countries. Then what a person could do is they could come in here and type in a B, and it would find every single country that had a B in it. See what I'm saying? So what it does is it can cut down the size when you're starting to search through something. All right. A slider does this. Typically, if you want to be able to use the slider, it says choose a number between 1 and 100. Well, that just says low and high. That's very hard to tell. Typically, when you use a slider, you also use some JavaScript with it, so they're able to get the exact value that they put in there. Spinners, you've all done this. For instance, when I've got my choice, if I decide that I want to print something out for the class, so I come over here and I say print. All right? I hope I didn't just print it. But if I say print, I can go up and there's that spinner on the top that says how many copies do you want. By default, it says 1. There's a little up arrow and a down arrow. I can keep clicking the up arrow, or I can just manually go in there because I always type in 11, 1 for each one of you and 1 that I have. All right, so that's done with a spinner. There's a calendar control. Again, everybody has probably seen that. That's much more in vogue today. You don't want to make a user type in a date. All right, so you put in a calendar control. There's a color form control that will bring up the color palette. And again, they have you do another example in here where you run through this stuff. And the last thing that's discussed in the chapter here, and it's an important concept, I wish you would have given it more than the bottom paragraph at the end of the chapter here, but it's right here. And I realize it's hard for you to read, but it's on the bottom of page 433 in your book. I will tell you, there is a chance. Let's suppose that Evan is interviewing for a job, okay? And it's a job for a web developer. A question that you could be asked is, what's the difference between progressive enhancement, all right, and graceful degradation? Progressive enhancement, it says right here, it says you use this with progressive enhancement in mind. Non-supporting browsers will display text boxes. In English, the difference between them is this. If you use progressive enhancement, what you do is you suppose that everyone who's looking at your website has a good browser and a modern browser. So you put in all of these niceties that we just looked at in there. All right? Now, not everybody will have them. So we put in a bunch of stuff at the beginning. If you remember this, we put in some of that HTML5 stuff that basically said, if you don't recognize what it is, just treat it like a text box. All right? But you're starting with the best in mind. All right? So you're progressively enhancing from the beginning and you're working your way down. On the other hand, with graceful degradation, what you do is you're basically going the other way. All right? And I think I did it forwards and not backwards. I may have, because I did it before where I've said the explanation and I've said it backwards. And hopefully I didn't right there. But if I come through here and I type in graceful degradation versus progressive enhancement. So if I did it wrong, I apologize. I don't think I did, but I might have. You can always go to the source, which is W3 Schools, and they'll explain it in there. All right? So that's it. It's 9:49. I know we already took a break. Why don't you take another one and come back at 10 o'clock, and then at 10, we're going to look at this example. I'm going to run through the bootstrap stuff with you. If it's easier for you, then just watch. If it's not easy, if you want to play along, so to speak, you can do that. But there's quite a bit of typing you'd have to do. It's up to you. All right?